toda la cartera, se lo tuve que
Good
enviar por
afternoon and welcome. My name is Joe Rodriguez, and I have the honor of moderating today's Civic Engagement panel. By way of introduction, I work for United States Senator Richard Blumenthal. I am his Deputy State Director. I oversee operations for his 2 Connecticut Senate offices. I am also a board member for the National Puerto Rican Agenda and former president of the Connecticut Hispanic Democratic Caucus, which is the only statewide political PAC, Political Action Committee in the state of Connecticut. So thank you all for being here. For those who were just in the larger discussion with our elected officials, you may have witnessed that they touched upon community engagement from a broad perspective, right? They discussed the importance of their communities being active and engaged on issues impacting the Puerto Rican community, both on the mainland of the States as well as in Puerto Rico. So this particular panel, we are going to get a bit more in depth. How do we do that? It's easy to say, let's get active, and we should be active, but how do we do that? So we have 3 remarkable panelists today, beginning with José López, who is a lecturer of Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago, and also the director of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center in Chicago. Let's hear it for José. Policy at Rutgers University and the director of the Latino Leadership Institute. Round of applause. And last but certainly not least, we have Zoe Colón, who is the community leader and activist from Orlando, Florida. Thank you, Zoe, for being here. So again, very briefly, and then we'll open it up to the 3 panelists. So in Connecticut, as you all know, we have roughly 250,000 Puerto Ricans. We are pretty, almost 50%, 51% of the total Latino population in the state of Connecticut. So it's a very high population in our state. We see higher concentrations in our urban hubs, but lately that has grown to cities like New Britain, Willimantic, Connecticut, Meriden, which you heard earlier today, New Haven, Hartford, and Bridgeport. In Hartford, I believe the total population of Puerto Ricans is 40% of the total population of the city. 40% is the highest in the state. We wrestle in Connecticut as someone, yes, I work for a senator, but as I tell folks, I'm Puerto Rican first. And I'm proud of that. I'm very active in our Puerto Rican community in the state, across the state, and we wrestle with these challenges every day. How do we get more active? In my lifetime of being active the last 10 years in Connecticut, as Puerto Rican leaders, and you've heard this perhaps in your own community, we've done so much for so many others. We've opened the door for so many others, our Latino brothers and sisters. We've done so much. In the state of Connecticut, 95% of our elected officials, Latino, are Puerto Rican. I believe the 10 or 11 legislators at the state capitol are all Puerto Rican. And we continue to do a whole lot for our brothers and sisters. But in the process, we failed to organize and mobilize for ourselves. And we are hurting for it in communities across this country as well as the island. So I believe this is long overdue, and I'm glad we are here. And I am eager to find out how we can build upon this energy, build upon this organizing here in New York and Holyoke and cities across this country and move forward. So with that said, I will present our first panelist, and again, it's José López.
So I am going to...
Mic or no mic?
Mic?
There you go.
So is it better? Okay. So anyhow, I'd rather do it this way. This is how I do my talks. So I'm okay. So I want to talk to you briefly about civic engagement from a totally different perspective. And that is the perspective of community building. and not community or not just community organizing. So I want to talk to you about the fact that we just had a huge victory with the success of the excarceration of my brother Oscar López Rivera. And thank you. And Oscar is coming back to Chicago for one day only on May 18th. He will come back to Chicago, and it will mark the 50th year of his community engagement. In 1966, there's a riot in Chicago, which, by the way, was probably the most intensive and extensive Puerto Rican popular uprising in the United States ever. In less than 3 days, they had to call out the National Guard. This is in 1966, June 12th, 13th, and 14th of 1966. And Oscar, my brother, would return from Vietnam almost 7 months later in 1967. When he came, I greeted him at the door, and we hugged, and he gave me his uniform and said, "I never want to see this again," and gave me his Bronze Star medal and told me, "I never want to see this again. I'm giving up the clothing and the vestments of a U.S. soldier for the streets of Chicago to do work in the streets as an organizer." My brother became one of the most important and effective community organizers in Chicago. And it is so that we're going to be celebrating, as he comes to Chicago, 45 years of the founding of the only Puerto Rican center curriculum, a Puerto Rican center curriculum in the United States, a high school for Puerto Rican dropouts. We will be celebrating the fact that it took almost 5-6 years of struggle to build one of the most important high schools in Chicago 42 years ago. And I could go on and tell you about a whole series of institutions that were built in Chicago that ultimately are informed by the work that my brother began to do 50 years ago. And so for me, the marriage of a community organizing piece with a community building piece. And what I mean by community building is that we struggle for all the rights of the Puerto Rican people in Chicago. But at the same time, we meant to build our own institutions. And so I can tell you right now that in Chicago, we have a whole host of Puerto Rican institutions, including the only national Puerto Rican museum in the United States. And I could point to you an area that if you live there, and one of my favorite people is here, Yarimar Bonilla, who happens to be a professor at Rutgers, and she's a wonderful part of our work in Chicago and has been. But, and she can attest to some of these things, but the fact is that in Chicago, we have built a community that if you walk through that community, you would think you're in Puerto Rico. And that's something that probably very few areas could claim, both in terms of cultural, commercial, and political power. I just want to probably add something very interesting. That we are celebrating the 50th year of Oscar's work in Chicago's Puerto Rican community. We're celebrating the 30th year of Luis Gutierrez as an elected official. And Luis Gutierrez became the most effective voice of immigrants in this country and the undocumented. And it was not because it was politically correct, it was because we have a history, long history of Puerto Rican, Mexican, and Latino solidarity. We actually developed a slogan, Boricua Mexicano luchando mano en mano. That has been a slogan in Chicago's Latino community for the past 50 years. So I say this to you because I want you to sort of look at our work within that framework and within the context of not your traditional door knocking and the kind of things that I know it's effective and important, but it must be, our work must be deeply rooted in a people's community and in a people's history.
Our next speaker, Mr. Estades, is an adjunct professor.
Estades,
perdón.
Está de día, está de noche.
He's the director of the Latino Leadership Institute, and he will be touching upon a few things, but more specifically, strategically dealing with civic engagement projects such as our electoral training and public policy education in a regional fashion, which is very important. So,
Okay.
so anyway.
Well, never let the most charismatic person in the panel speak first,
We'll get back
because
to-
then there is
he'll
not
close
much
us-
that we can
He'll
do.
close us out.
Okay. Now, anyway, good to see you after so many years. Well, let me make this very briefly. The Latino Leadership Institute basically is a copy of the Southwest voter registration project in California and the Southwest, I mean, literally Southwest. In 1996, I was doing voter registration in the East Coast of the United States. For the 1996 presidential election, my boss was Dennis Rivera from 1199, and I was the executive director, and my board was Bill Richardson, who was Secretary of Energy, Henry Cisneros, who was Secretary of Housing, and Dennis Rivera. I didn't need more than that in that board. So we divided the country in three in order to do voter registration in the United States. We took care, the Hispanic Educational Legal Fund, we took care of the East Coast. And I had the opportunity to go to one of the trainings of the Southwest voter registration in LA, and I saw how they train people to run for office and to become political managers. That idea came from Willie Villegas. I don't know if you had the chance to meet him in the past, and he died a long time ago. He was one of the best friends of the labor leader, Mexican labor leader, Chicano labor leader, forgot his name.
Cesar Chavez.
Cesar Chavez. And he used to fight with Cesar all the time and tell, this is the story that the Chicano brothers tells me. Always was fighting with him because, we go through these strikes, we go after all these fights, and we're about to win the struggle. And then at the end, the elected officials come and they betray us. So we need to do something in order to change that reality after all this work that Jose was talking about, that start very grassroots from the bottom up. And then when you're about to gain a victory, elected officials always make a deal behind your back, especially during those years. And since then, the Southwest voter registration has been more alive for more than 45 years. We didn't have anything here in the East Coast similar to that. So I told Dennis, we need to do the same thing in the East Coast because we have the Puerto Rico Legal Defense Fund, we have the Puerto Rican Policy Institute, but we don't have a training academy that can train young people in order to do the electoral work that is necessary. So we began in 1999. Long story, we didn't do much after that. In 2013, we began again. 2011, we began again, and we have trained over 2,000 people. Why is that important? Especially if we want to contribute and help Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, but also Puerto Ricans in the United States. If we don't gain political power, besides doing the typical organizing that many Puerto Ricans did before I was born here in the United States. For example, there is a place called here Borinquen Health Center that it was created 50 years ago. That was done by Puerto Ricans that were not that political. They just had to do things. So there are many institutions. El Museo del Barrio, it was created by the same people. So there are all these institutions that we had, but we never had a political institution that basically could help us. So that's what we do now. And to make the story short, we have a chapter in New York, we have a chapter in Florida, and we are a volunteer organization. We also had a chapter in Temple University in Philadelphia. And what we do is that we train people to run for office. And also to become organizers, political organizers. They don't have to run for office. In Florida, it was our first year last year. And 2 of our students ran for the first time and became elected in Florida. and very progressive students. We're trying to expand through the Northeast. Our strategy, just to finish with that, our strategy is basically to concentrate on those states with high electoral colleges in the East Coast, and that there is a significant Puerto Rican population and Latino population that basically can create a difference. For example, in Florida, between Orlando and Tampa, there are 43% of the registered voters on the state are in the I-4 corridor from Orlando to Tampa, of registered voters. That's where the fight is in Orlando in every election. That's where the Puerto Rican population is the majority. So there is a lot of work to be done in order for us to lobby, to make elected officials accountable, and to create coalitions with other groups in order to advocate for what we do, and I mean for our needs in the United States, but also in Puerto Rico.
Our third panel, I won't say last, our third panelist is Zoe Colón, and she is a community leader in Orlando who has done a whole lot of community work and grassroots work out in Orlando, and we're honored to have you, Zoe.
Thank you. I'm honored to be sitting next to people that I really admire, and also to be the only woman. Woo woo. And I find myself in that situation too often, so we need to put people through your Latino leadership program and certainly send them over to Chicago, where I have a lot of respect for the work that you do there. I feel like it's a boot camp for community organizing, badass organizing. Bueno, so I am originally from the Bronx. Yay! No? I don't get love in New York? Okay. Bueno, so I'm originally from the Bronx, born and raised in the Bronx, and then moved to Westchester and worked with the immigrant population for 10 years, and then really learned about advocacy and social justice movements through the immigration reform movement. So my trajectory was a little different, but I'm really blessed to have been through that path. And then now I moved 2 years ago to Orlando, and then I feel like I'm right in the heart again of just a historical moment for the Puerto Rican community, and living through it and helping in any way that I can. And I take a lot of pride in that. But I also come in with the mentality, the New York mentality, and I know that it takes a lot more, it takes so many different sectors to get involved in community for this to work. And so that's what I'm gonna be talking about today, civic engagement and really looking at infrastructure and what Orlando needs to do to meet the needs of that newly arrived population. So as Jaime was talking about, we have nearly 500,000 Puerto Ricanos in Central Florida. Debatable if you include Tampa or not, but almost 500,000 just in the I-4 corridor region, right? Again, including parts of Tampa. And then over 1 million in Florida, rivaling New York's number, right? So the number one destination has always been New York historically, now it's Florida, and to some extent Houston, Texas, and other places where they're recruiting teachers. So I won't get into the specifics that have already been covered. I'll try to speak mostly to Florida and Central Florida in particular. So as you know, there's this brain drain out of Puerto Rico, right? A lot of young professionals, well-educated folks that are motivated to get involved. Some will stay on the island to try to build that economy or rebuild that economy, but also many who have chosen to leave, and out of necessity and desperation in all reality. And so that brings an influx of talent into Florida. So there's a lot to work with, right? So whereas a lot of our politicians don't realize that, right? That we have this huge influx, of talent from Puerto Rico, and that we really just need to create systems to support that talent and to make sure that they thrive. So as you know, we have the fastest growing population of Puerto Ricanos in Florida. We, again, concentrated mostly in Orlando and Kissimmee, although there are, it's changing rapidly because of housing conditions and shortages in that region. We're the new Mecca, and, I feel like sometimes we're kind of in a time warp. We're in the socio-political climate of New York in the 1940s and 50s, right? Where we have all these hungry folks just getting ready, rolling up their sleeves, gearing up to get involved, but very little infrastructure politically and economically even. So I'll just, again, just something that you should notice is, or note, is that the fastest growing region as far as Hispanics in the United States is the southeast corridor of the United States, and that has not been the case historically, right? It's been the northeast, it's been California, so we're talking about the southeast region of the corridor now having the largest and the fastest growing, well, the fastest growing, not the largest, that's an error, the fastest growing Hispanic population, and while other states are seeing an influx of immigrants from Mexico and Central America, in Florida is quite different. Son los caribeños, right? So it's really interesting if you really look at it. I tend to think like a sociologist, so excuse that. But anyway, so we have this influx from mostly Puerto Rico, but also Cuba, right? And there's so many differences there politically, right? And so we'll leave that to another conversation. But you would think that we're poised, right, for the Boricua vote to really make a difference, right? So we're saying, okay, we have this influx from Puerto Rico. As soon as people land, they can vote, right? They're also more exposed to American, quote unquote, American culture, language, and values because of our complex relationship to the U.S., right? So if you look at other states that have this influx of immigrant families, and that reality, and also undocumented status, right? We have an advantage in that sense, right? So we come in, we have status, and we can actually vote. But we have some challenges, and I'm going to share those with you. So I personally was involved in some of the voter registration and get out the vote efforts in Central Florida. I worked with State Voices Table through Hispanic Federation, which I worked with for a year and a half, and Que Vote Mi Gente, which was a coalition of organizations that came together, both grass tops and grassroots organizations that came together and had a real kick-ass communications plan. Natasha's here and some other folks that were involved to really get out the Puerto Rican vote. And millions of dollars were poured into the I-4 corridor because of exactly what the co-panelists shared, right, and our moderator, right? Because again, we're poised really to make a difference and shape that vote. But we have some challenges, right? And one, and I'll just go through them, no particular order. So in Florida, right, you can choose to be a no party affiliation, right? So NPA, that is the fastest growing party affiliation in Florida. No party affiliation. So a lot of the newly arrived are also disillusioned, right? They're coming in and they're saying, wait a second, I'm just tired of dealing with corruption in Puerto Rico, these different administrations, no matter if they were blue, if they were red, no matter what, camp they were coming from, contributed to the crisis that we're in now. And so I really just don't want to participate in the political process, right? So there's that. There's the fact that more and more people, again, are saying, well, I don't want to be ninguno de los dos partidos, no party affiliation. What happens is that we have a closed primary state. That means that if you're not affiliated with a party, you cannot vote in that election, in that primary. So you have to have an affiliation, Democrat or Republican, in order to participate in that primary. So that's one challenge for our community. Also, geographic landscape. So we have gated communities, right? I grew up in the Bronx where there was a building with like 500 people in it. So if I want to register my entire building, or 500 people, I could just walk up and down the steps, right? Florida is very different geographically. So you have, again, not very pedestrian friendly. We have single family homes, low rise buildings, hot weather, right? So people want to drive, they don't want to walk. So who are you talking to if everyone's driving, right? So it's really, really hard to do political engagement, civic engagement in that kind of landscape. We also have vast differences, and we don't have to belabor this, right, in ideologies and priorities between the newly arrived from Puerto Rico, okay? And then we can get deeper into that by age. Then we have stateside transplants like myself. I come from Nueva York, and my experience is very different from someone who comes from Puerto Rico. And then you have the Florida natives, and they're all like, well, who are all these people coming in, right? And so I'm originally from Orlando, and Orlando has changed, and so very different ideologies. And also between sectors, right? So we have a very siloed Puerto Rican community. There's business leaders that are doing really well, that are very influential, but don't get involved in politics at all, just under no circumstances. It's too radicalized, right? So if you're in Orlando and you get involved in politics, you're a radical. God forbid, right? So it's like you're tainted, right? And so it's very siloed between the different sectors. I'll also say that we need a lot more training in community activism, right? We don't understand it as well as we should in order to really mobilize our people. Some folks I've seen this recently, some people will just vote based on someone being Puerto Rican and not the quality of that candidate. So that's happening a lot, particularly, someone who doesn't have a lot of education or doesn't understand the political process. Hace boricua, pues yo voy con ese. right? And he's like the worst candidate, right? So Latino leadership, here you go. Like, this is where you have to help us do, develop these candidates. And then we have a very interesting influx of institutions that are coming in. So I should preface that with, we don't have institutional infrastructure. I come from New York. We had the Puerto Rican Family Institute, Casita Maria in the Bronx, right? Settlement houses and all these different programs and Puerto Rican led and Puerto Rican service organizations that really empowered the community in addition to providing services, right? So you go there for an English class, and when they tell you, hey, it's really important for you to sign off on this petition, you feel engaged because you have a relationship with that community center. We just don't have that in Orlando. What we do have, though, is this heavy reliance on well-funded national and New York-based organizations that have been doing this for a very long time that are now coming into Florida. Right? And so it's really interesting because it's somewhat of a learning curve, right? So if you did business in New York and you've been around for 30 years, New York is a very blue state. You go to Florida, it's a whole new climate, right? So there's something to be learned there, right? From the institutions that are very strong and very well funded, but new to Florida. And we also have a growing conservative base of evangelicals, right? And so they're coming in and, there are very divisive issues like abortion and, there's just some issues that our community, especially the newly arrived, once you advocate for, pro-choice, for example, that's it. Like, that institution is tainted by a very conservative, house of worship, for example, right? So those houses of worship, those churches, are very influential, very powerful, oftentimes the only institution that our people are tied to, but work on their own and very siloed and often very conservative. So that's a challenge. So I will have to skip to my, right, over time?
We'll come back, though.
We'll come back, okay. Well, so I'll just leave you with the opportunities, and the opportunities are to invest in institutional infrastructure. And I will stress to you that we need more young people and also to lead these groups, and also for the newly arrived, that mom that just came from Puerto Rico, that's driving the Uber, that's working in Walmart, for those movements to be led by those people, not by the New Yorkers that just arrived, and I'll include myself in that, right? But also, I can't be that face, right? Because I don't have that experience. And if that's the group that needs most of the help right now, and most of the organizing, it really should be led by those people. So I'll stop there, but I hope that I was able to provide some insight on what's happening in Orlando, because there's a lot.
I believe we have roughly 30 minutes or so. I know we're running behind from the previous spin. It's only 3:40, so I think we're good on timing. So if I may, I want to inject some questions, and then we'll open to a more broader dialogue. Because as someone who worked in the community, or continues to work in the community in Connecticut, I think it's important, since it's a civic engagement, to let the folks here know, let's dig deeper, right? Let's dig deeper. We talked about, Jose mentioned not just organizing, but engaging and building. How do we do that, Jose? So for a community that might have the numbers of Boricuas, and they have in recent years elected a few Latino Puerto Rican leaders, how do they get to stage, A to Z? How do they get to that point?
I think that for me, the idea of community building has to start out with the notion that a community is an ecosystem. And so our perception and our vision should be framed within a social ecology model. What does that mean? That a community is an ecosystem, and therefore everything in that community is interconnected. And if you're going, community organizing has traditionally, in the Saul Alinsky model, has been based on single issue politics. And that's great, and that's good. And a lot of our good leftists and progressive friends do a lot of that, but it's very limited. Particularly if you start out with people who are marginalized beyond the question of class. And I want to be very clear that we're not, for us to talk about Puerto Ricans is to talk about a colonial situation. And to talk about the Puerto Rican migration is to speak about the migration from the context of a people who experience a change in place. We're no longer in San Juan or in Ay Bonito or in Ponce. We're in the Bronx. We're in Orlando. We are in Humboldt Park. We change place, but not condition. I want to make it very clear that unless we take almost a decolonizing vision of community organizing, I think we lose it. I'm sorry. I'm a strong believer in that, and I've seen it. And so for me, the idea is, what do you do with a colonized population? There are three things that must inform that. The right of self-determination, because people who are colonized have never been able to self-determine themselves. And by the way, that includes broad sectors of people in this country. It includes African Americans and Native Americans. It includes many people who are in a colonial relationship. And my contention is that because Puerto Ricans change space, but not condition, that we move from an external colonial situation to an internal colonial situation. And all you have to do is visit Holyoke, Massachusetts. And in Holyoke, the people that live in the flats are all Puerto Ricans. The people that live on the hills are all Irish. Who has the power? The Irish, not the Puerto Ricans. There's something wrong with that picture. And that's a historical picture that dates back to the 1950s. So for me, that is something that we have to be able to understand. And if we don't, then I think we got a problem. And that means that so it's self-determination, self-actualization, and self-reliance. And I don't mean self-reliance from the vantage point of what Trump and the Ayn Rand people believe in. I'm talking about self-reliance from collective self-reliance. There was a study that was just done in Chicago on health inequities and disparities in Chicago's 5 different communities. And one of the interesting things is that the Puerto Rican community comes out with the highest rate of PTSD syndrome. Now think about that in the context of mental wellness, and then think about it, what we should be doing in addressing that reality, which, by the way, if I went around the country, I would find the same picture everywhere where there are Puerto Ricans, including where Puerto Rican middle class established themselves, because we have a problem. And it's a problem that's deeply rooted in our colonial situation, where we have learned to underestimate. It's what Frantz Fanon so well articulated in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, is that the realm of the colonized and the realm of the colonizer are 2 different realms. Mm-hmm. And what we're informed is that as a colonized human being, we become the quintessence of evil, and everything becomes bad. And we learned that very early. And so we need to change that discourse, and we need to change from the language of being stuck in this colonial reality to the discourse of possibilities as a decolonized people.
Very good. One question to piggyback, and I'm going to segue your way. Jose mentioned, marginalizing or a disconnect. So we alluded to it earlier in her remarks. How do we? So you lead an institute where we can help bridge the two, right? So how do we get from what Zoe mentioned earlier in her statement, that folks, for whatever reason, they don't want to be active? So how do we get from building our community, being marginalized, to getting someone, let's say, to walk into your door and want to join the institute, to have the tools that they need to run for office or to be more engaged? How do we get there?
Well, it's part of the philosophy of the Latino Leadership Institute to basically, we have to be non-partisan. For example, we don't talk about the Democratic Party or the Republican Party because we're non-partisan, we're a 501c3. So that takes care of the issue of partisanship in the classroom. Now, after 7 years of doing this, it's very difficult not to have that discussion in the classroom. But that discussion has to be welcome because it's in the context of non-partisanship. So that is not so much of a problem because we talk about the mechanics of how to organize politically, mechanics, not ideology. But the discussion of ideology always comes through. Whoever says that that doesn't come through, it hasn't been through a real discussion, in politics. So, but thank God for the 501c3, which forced us to be nonpartisan in order to attract everybody. But there is an issue also of coalition that I wanted to talk about, the building coalition, that goes back to the point that Jose brought up. We have an issue because we can deal with the Latino, the Puerto Rican community. We have a lot of issues with evangelicals, especially in Central Florida, who tend to be more conservative than the rest of the population and tend to vote very different from the rest of the population. We're aware of that. And we need to go through that because it's something we learned from the civil rights movement in the United States is that you need churches and you need the religious group in order to change the country. But there is a contradiction when you deal with people who are very, very conservative and are not as progressive as the African Americans were in the South during the 1960s. So that's a challenge for us. But what Jose brought up is very important, especially when he talks about Fanon. Fanon was very critical of why European Marxists, of why European socialists, because their analysis, and I know that this is not a socialist type of discussion, but I have to bring it up, because a lot of progressive whites in the United States make an analysis of us and of class that is based on the conception that everybody is equal within the class. And we're not equal within the class. There are differences between the class. For example, a white worker and a Latino worker, an African worker that make the same amount of money in that factory are not equal when they get out of the factory. When they go to their neighborhoods, they go to 3 different neighborhoods. Because the Irish, the Scottish, the English, that come from that heritage, that come from the foundation of this country, basically gave them more privileges that have been inherited to them than the lack of privilege that black and Latinos got. So we got to very poor neighborhoods. They got to a neighborhood maybe middle class that they benefit from those being workers. And what the system does is that they use them in order to divide us as workers. And what we always tell them, I'm always fighting with them, is that if you want to make a good class analysis, race has to be included. Nationality has to be included, because if not, the class analysis is incomplete. And they continue to push to this day the class analysis that everybody's equal and we don't want to bring the issue of race. Don't bring Black Lives Matter. Don't bring the issue of colonization of Puerto Rico. In the 70s and the 80s, the problems that we had with the CP, that they wanted Puerto Rico to be a statehood just because they thought that everybody's a worker. You don't understand the analysis there. So those are issues that we have when we create coalitions. And in Florida, we lost basically because the Democratic Party, the progressives in the Democratic Party in Florida had that mentality, and they treated Puerto Ricans and poor people and working people like everybody had the same vision when it wasn't. And that's why we lost Florida. 30 electoral colleges. In Pennsylvania, we have 15 electoral colleges that we should have, we didn't want Trump to win, that we should have won, whether Sanders or Hillary eventually, that we should have won if the Democratic Party had understood a good class analysis, which they didn't do it. Because they left the workers out. They left the white workers out. They left the Puerto Rican workers out. The African American workers out of that analysis. So I just wanted to piggyback on that.
We're going to open to questions, and I'm going to have Zoe respond first. And Zoe, feel free if you want to piggyback.
I just wanted to make sure that folks don't leave the room thinking that newly arrived Puerto Ricans don't want to be involved in the political process. what happened was is that we were very excited in their potential to get involved in the political process. And in developing issue-based campaigns, we thought that talking about the crisis in Puerto Rico was going to motivate people to go out and vote. And it was quite the contrary. So we actually found, through Que Vote Mi Gente and some of the research that was done there, that people coming from the island, really wanted to learn more about how to navigate the school system, how to access workforce development programs, how to get a well-paying job, that they were more inclined to align themselves with increase in the minimum salary, por ejemplo, the fight for $15 per hour, than they were about the fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico. And we learned from that, and I think, again, it goes back to needing to develop institutions that are led by the families that we're talking about, and not necessarily by folks that parachute in and out. And I'm gonna include myself in that, because I don't know how long it takes to be a native of Orlando, right? But I understand, because I've been on that side of the fence, that you really need to engage those folks to be the ones to develop the issues that they're gonna resonate with. So I'll leave it at that.
Great point. So, floor is yours. What are your concerns? What are your questions? What is anything we're saying resonating? This young man right here.
Hi, my name is Carmelo Cintron. I come from New Jersey. It's very curious because I feel like when I moved here 5 years ago, I was thinking more along the lines of, oh, sorry.
Can I see that?
Should I stand or? I'll just stand. So when I moved here 5 years ago to New Jersey, I feel like my thought process was more along the lines of, well, if I tried being political at home in Puerto Rico and that didn't work, what are the Democrats or the Republicans going to give me here? Like, they don't care about me over there, or out with my people, and we're all together in a big problem. Why would they care about me here, right? So it was like, I don't need to participate, or I'm not going to affiliate to any of these parties. In part because of the thought process that José and Estades.
Está de Dios, está de noche.
Bring to the table, right? The thought process was, I'm a colonized being, we're colonial people, I need to decolonize myself and my people before I can be able to become a straightforward agent, right? But on the other hand, we also have the political reality of, once we're here, you have representatives, and it could be a Puerto Rican, or it could be a Puerto Rican hater, right? It could be, your president could be one or the other, and it counts for something. But then when you have these conversations, focusing on the voting process and voter registration, how could that detract from us being able to also look at our main issue, which is coloniality and being colonial beings? And also, to José, how can focusing a lot in our communities and decolonizing ourselves and our actions become an issue then to really rally people behind this very colonial and colonialistic system of domination, which is the Democrats and the Republicans? And then rally behind a Democrat or a Republican candidate.
Well, the first thing is that if you're deeply rooted in a community, look, if I went through and I told you the stories of political repression that we face in Chicago, most of you would run away. In 1976, the FBI landed a helicopter on top of my house looking for my brother, right? Puerto Ricans were stopped in Chicago, really on roadblocks, and picked up and put in jail for nothing because they were looking for the FALN. Now, there was an excuse because, and I told the guy who was heading this investigation, who, by the way, is the guy who leads still to this day the campaign against my brother being honored by the Puerto Rican parade, because he says my brother killed the son of a policeman. Let me just make the story clear. When Francis Tavern takes place in 1975, the FBI has documented that my brother was in Puerto Rico and they were following him. So my brother could not have participated in the attack on Francis Tavern. So it's a lie, but the New York Post puts it as a headline that he is my father's killer. So what I want to tell you is that there are very few groups of people that I think have gone through the political repression that we have gone through, and I'm talking to you for a very, very long time, that has been able to survive. And more importantly, if I look at the Black Panther, right now, one of the leaders of the Black Panther just died in prison. There are at least 7 members of the Black Panther Party who are still political prisoners in the United States, and they're in prison. Why? How is it that we were able to build a movement that in 25 days we garnered 109 petitions, and we the people, we took to the White House 105,000 signed petitions. That means 213,000 people signed to release my brother, right? That's something that no issue in Puerto Rico you could measure ever. Where the Pope of the Catholic Church intervenes, where you have all of the presidents of the major labor movements, the president of the AFL-CIO, SCIU, EFSME, sent letters to the president of the United States a week before his release, where the ex-president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, does that, where people march in every community where there are Puerto Ricans demanding my brother's release. How did we do that? In spite of the fact that we were under tremendous political repression. That if I was to describe it to you, you would completely, probably freak out. And I can tell you that when I told the FBI, this guy, the FBI agent Han, I said to him, you know, you can continue to pursue me 24 hours a day, and you can do whatever you want, and I'm glad you're doing it because you'll never get to the FALN by doing that. Because their whole idea is that the independence movement, and we were the front of the FALN. So what I'm trying to tell you is when you're deeply rooted in a community, I went to jail for 7 months for refusing to cooperate with a grand jury. I was one of the grand jury resistors. And I did it, and the first event that was done in Chicago to raise money for me was done by the cursillistas. 400 cursillistas came together to raise money in a church in Puerto Rico, in Chicago. I can tell you about everything else because people saw what we were doing. We were building community. We were building schools. We were building healthcare institutions. We were building things that people needed. And so they didn't see us as the enemy. And we put out a slogan in 1980 when the other group of people was arrested. And the slogan says, no son terroristas, son patriotas, transformando derrotas en victorias. Well, my brother just got out 6 editorials in the most conservative newspaper in Puerto Rico, El Nuevo Día, called for his release, calling him a patriot. The bulk of the Puerto Rican political class came out in support of my brother. The mayor of my town, San Sebastián, is an ardent statehooder. He's been one of the most important voices in the release of my brother. And he organized within the PNP to get a great deal of the leadership of the PNP, including the new governor of Puerto Rico, to come on board around my brother's case. So when you think about Oscar being transformed into an emblematic figure of unity, you can see how a work that's deeply rooted in a community can have incredible impact, not only in that community, but across the United States and in the world.
Saying about the FBI and the horrendous struggle that there's been since the 60s, since the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and his brothers Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King and and having any kind of social justice in our last 40, 50 years here. What do you think of the firing of Comey? I would like to ask you, because you're in this fight against the FBI. I personally think it took extreme courage, and I think it may clean out some of the problems that we have. The FBI has been running both parties from the top down, and they terrorize everyone.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them a possibility of answering, and then we can go back to that question.
Can I just add something?
Because we are now falling in an area
Right.
where,
Yeah.
so I want to try to keep it to sort of the grassroots civic, but Jose will be available if you want to quickly chat afterwards, man. Is that okay? So Zoe, and then anyone else had a question? Questions? Okay, so Zoe, you want to say a few words? You want to?
Yeah, I just need to add something really quick.
I have a question. I had some actually feedback.
Please.
I can just talk about
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, so basically, like everything we're discussing here, like about voting, because I'm hearing everything what they were speaking upstairs, and it's just like a merry-go-round. It's just so much, and I think that to make a change is so complicated. This what I'm listening to is a lot of information. It's overwhelming, and you don't know where to start. And then we having these conferences, and things are still the same. Nothing changes. So I think that we could try to find a solution to get actions, things done. And it starts in office. Who is in office? Some of these people that go in office, they're not in it for the right reasons. They're not in it for the American people. Who's in office right now in Puerto Rico? Who's in charge in Puerto Rico? It starts in the community. No, it doesn't. The people in the communities, they lose hope because they see that our leaders, they don't give I'm sorry to say, excuse me, I'm not gonna say the whole word. They don't give a F. Look at what happened right now. Look at the problems we're having right now with this administration. Look at the two candidates we had. I'm with her. No, she's supposed to be for us, for the American people. She wanted to make history and be the first woman president. Sorry to say, but she didn't give a diddly squat about the American people. I don't think she was in it for that very reason. So people were voting for the other one because they didn't want to vote. They were voting for her because they were scared to vote for him. And then he was he was saying things that people wanted to hear that no other candidate. So people believed him and went and voted for him. And look at what happened. President Obama, I was looking, just random stuff. The last hours of his presidency, he sent $221 million to Palestine in humanitarian aid. What are you doing?
Yeah, I think that.
How can you fix the problems? How can you help other people? We need that money here. We have so many problems.
Well, that
money can't help in Puerto Rico.
That fire in your belly.
Hold
on, yeah, I'm gonna connect. The fire in your belly is what we need. So let's just say that. Let's start with that, right? Yes, that's what we need. So, yes. Dale, yes. Dale, that's what we need. When I became angry, and this is gonna bring it back to institutions.
What are we doing? You know what? I'm not racist, but you know what? The middle.
Yes, I'm gonna get back to that. Yes. So when I got angry, I don't know if you've ever heard, stay woke, despierta boricua. There's all these, right? I got woke in undergrad when I took my first Latino studies course, and I learned about my history. Okay, se me paran los pelos. Because I didn't realize, I thought, hey, as Puerto Ricans, we benefit from U.S. citizenship. You can't have it any better. Mi papá y esta gente trabajaba en la factoría en Barceloneta, all gravy, right? And then I found out, not only that we had been exploited at the hands of U.S., but that all these Latin American countries, and I got really angry, and I got that fire that you have right now, and I got involved. Civic engagement is comprised of many different facets. There's the grassroots level, there's the grass tops. Even communication strategies could be involved in civic engagement. The political process, elected officials. You can get involved at any level that you think you're going to best fit, right? And that fire in your belly tells me probably grassroots, because you might kill two or three people in Congress. But Right. Well, so you can, and you can. Dale, do it. So that's the point.
Okay.
So we need young people. We need young people to know their history. We need young people to know their history, and this is why Chicago has been so successful, right? Because they've exposed people to that history. And I want to stress that in Florida, we don't have those institutions. We don't have Latino studies. So imagine, I got really active in my community when I learned my history. Floridians are not even learning that history unless there's nonprofits coming in to do it. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your passion, and let's make sure you channel that so you can get to the White House.
Make the story short. There are 30 electoral colleges in Florida. There are 15 in Pennsylvania. There are 30 electoral colleges in Florida, 15 in Pennsylvania. New Jersey, around 20. You can win a presidential election, and you can change everything in those states if you are trained and understand electoral politics. I can talk only about what we do. Electoral politics have become an industry. It has become a science. You cannot go around just distributing flyers on the street without knowing where you are distributing them. We deal with the science of getting elected, with the science of organizing politically, and we are focusing in Florida, Pennsylvania. We deal with universities. The Latino Leadership Institute has classes here in this room from September to December, and we teach from petitions, campaign finance, field operations, how to get elected, how to put together an electoral plan, how to create a message. All that is part of a science. So to say, yes, we're going to get, yes, that the fire is there, but we need to get that diamond, and we need to polish it in order to compete, because there are monsters out there that are run by corporations. Elections are won by corporations now. So I don't know many Puerto Ricans are millionaires, let me tell you. There are decisions that the Supreme Court of the United States are deciding, basically making corporations people. They made a decision the other day, give Hobby Lobby 2 years ago. They gave a corporation that they call a small business religious rights. Mm-hmm. Because it's a small business, but they have 55,000 workers. Wow. I have never seen a bodega like that. So we are competing against a monster out there in order to get elected. Thank God for Luis Gutierrez. Let me tell you one thing. In the 1990s, we counted, when we were doing the presidential election in 96, there were 11 Puerto Ricans elected officials in the United States that were independentistas. 2 in Chicago. There was a brother in Chicago besides Luis Gutierrez. I forgot his name. 2 in Pennsylvania, that you know them. I forgot their name too.
Maria King Jones was here.
Yeah, and in Connecticut, there was another brother. In Puerto Rico, there was 1 elected. We have more elected independentistas in the United States than in Puerto Rico. Okay? But they had to go through all that education on the street and also understanding how things work. That's what we bring. And we're a volunteer organization. I don't get paid. I've been doing this for 7 years. We have chapters in Pennsylvania, Orlando, and here. And you have to do a little bit of sacrifice in order to do that. It's not only saying it. And I say sacrifice next to these men. You know? What I do cannot compare to that.
Thank you. 4:11. I think we have until about 4:15 if I'm doing the math correctly and what we ran behind. Otherwise, we keep going until someone stops us. So, any other questions? 5 more minutes or stop? 2 more minutes. So 1 more question. 1 last question. See, no, he's going to speak with you before we leave here. And so there's no questions. If I would ask the 3 panelists, very briefly, 60 seconds each, 1 final action item for the crowd here today.
Make it about Glass-Steagall.
Oh, please.
Back Glass-Steagall, because if you don't have it, you don't have buckets.
Okay, she has been talking about that since outside.
If you don't pass that federal law, bank separation, all of this is cheap talk, because we're all going to be dead. Wall Street Wow.
Well, thank you, ma'am. So one final action item for everyone here who is engaged, wants to be engaged, civic engagement, one action item, starting with you.
Look, very simple. I just do one thing and I concentrate on that thing. If you want to learn about electoral politics, the Latino Leadership Institute is available to you. We teach you everything from A and C. It's for free. You don't have to pay. We don't get paid. Carlos Vargas teaches public policy for us. He doesn't get paid because he doesn't want to get paid. But everything is for free. It's a sacrifice, and we are doing great things. I have a picture here that I want to show Jose. In 1996, in that picture, I have 3 pictures. Melissa Mark Viverito took the first class of the Latino Leadership Institute in a storefront with 90 degrees of heat in that storefront from 9 to 6 o'clock. She forgot about it, by the way. But that's another story.
Jose?
So go ahead, Jose.
Where can we get more info about the institute?
I have cards. I give you a
So for me, it's very simple. I think that whatever we do, whatever work we do, it has always to be framed within the context that it has to be organic in form and holistic in nature.
I'll speak to Florida. We're the new Mecca. We're the fastest growing Puerto Rican population, the newest, and we really need a lot of the infrastructure and lessons learned and best practices that we know from the other Puerto Rican hubs. And we also need money. So we find that the nonprofits in Florida get more money from outside of Florida than from within because of the political climate there. So we're looking for funders and everyone to be looking at Florida as the new Mecca and a place to invest in the Puerto Rican community, because we need to develop those institutions that have been developed in Chicago and New York and other hubs so that we can empower our people.